Meet Emma, a 19-year-old girl who, after her uncle's life is shattered by a ruthless taxi company, steps into a world of corruption, danger, and betrayal. From a desperate driver to a fierce fighter for justice, Emma's journey will leave you breathless. As she takes on the most powerful men in the city, can she save her family and herself? Her courage, heart, and unbreakable willpower will captivate you. Don't miss the twists and turns of her story. Where are you watching from? Subscribe to our channel to follow Emma's incredible journey. Emma Sullivan gripped the edge of her worn-out kitchen counter, her phone pressed tightly against her ear as she listened to the desperate, wheezing voice on the other end. "Emma, I need your help," her Uncle George gasped, his voice strained with pain. "They're going to take my medallion. If I lose it, I lose everything." Emma's stomach twisted. She glanced around her tiny apartment, the flickering overhead light barely illuminating the stacks of unopened bills on the table. She didn't have enough to pay rent, let alone save someone else. But this wasn't just someone else. This was Uncle George, the man who had taken her in after her parents' accident, who had worked double shifts driving his taxi so she could stay in school, who never let her go hungry even when it meant he would. "Take a deep breath, okay? We'll figure something out," she said, though her voice wavered. George let out a shaky sigh. "It's my back. The doctor says no driving for months, maybe longer. I tried to push through, but He broke off with a ragged cough. "I can't, Emma. If I don't get back on the road, they'll revoke my medallion and sell it to the highest bidder. That's how it works. I'll be done for." Emma clenched her jaw. She knew how ruthless the city's taxi commission was. Licenses were worth a fortune, and they didn't care who they destroyed to turn a profit. "How long do we have?" she asked. 2 weeks, officially," George said. "But these guys don't play fair. They could pull it any day if someone offers them the right price." Emma's mind raced. She had no savings, no backup plan. She had taken on odd jobs, waitressing and working in warehouses, but nothing stable had stuck. The thought of her uncle losing everything, after a lifetime of sacrifice, was unbearable. "Maybe I can fill in for you," she blurted out before she could guess herself. Silence. Then, George let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Emma, honey, you're 21, and a woman. The guys at the depot won't make it easy for you." "I don't care," she said, standing straighter. "I have a regular driver's license, and I can apply for a temporary taxi permit. I looked it up once." George sighed. "It's dangerous out there. The late-night drunks, the creeps. The industry is cutthroat." Emma swallowed her fear. A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, George's voice came through, quiet but resigned. "If you think you can pull it off, then I won't stop you." That night, Emma barely slept. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through what needed to be done. She had 2 weeks, maybe less, to navigate city regulations, fight for a permit, and prove herself in an industry that would rather see her fail. At dawn, she pulled on her cleanest t-shirt and jeans, tied her long brown hair into a ponytail, and caught the first bus across town to the Westbridge Taxi Depot. The lot was crammed with yellow cabs, the air thick with exhaust and stale cigarette smoke. A man in a grease-stained vest leaned against the office doorway, puffing on a cigarette. "You lost?" he asked, eyeing her with disinterest. "I need to speak with the manager," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Murphy, right?" The man gave a lazy shrug and jerked his thumb toward the trailer. Inside, the office was a cramped, cluttered space reeking of stale coffee. A burly man with salt and pepper hair sat behind a metal desk, rifling through a pile of paperwork. "Murphy?" Emma asked, stepping forward. The man barely looked up. "Yeah, what do you want?" "I'm Emma Sullivan. My uncle, George Sullivan, has been driving for you for 30 years. Murphy finally lifted his gaze, recognition flickering across his face. "Yeah. I heard about his back. Shame. He was one of the best. That's why I'm here," Emma said. "I want to take his place until he recovers." Murphy's brows shot up. You're just a kid." "I'm 21, and I can legally drive. I also know that city ordinance allows a temporary taxi permit under extenuating circumstances," she said, placing a printed form from the municipal website on his desk. Murphy scanned it, unimpressed. "I don't know how many female drivers you've seen around here, kid, but this isn't a friendly business." "I don't care," Emma said, her voice steady. "Uncle George can't lose his medallion. I'll do whatever it takes. Pass whatever test, learn whatever rules you throw at me." Murphy leaned back, rolling a toothpick between his teeth. "He's got 2 weeks left on that medallion hold. If you can get the permit in that time, I won't stop you. But if you screw up once, you're out." Emma's heart pounded, but she forced herself to nod. Deal. That night, she called Uncle George with the news. He sounded relieved but anxious. "Just be careful out there, honey," he murmured. "It's a tough world behind that wheel." Emma clutched her phone tightly, staring out at the city skyline. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She wasn't backing down. The morning air was crisp as Emma stepped into the taxi depot for her first official shift. The reality of what she had signed up for hit her as she weaved through a sea of skeptical faces, grizzled old drivers, weary from years on the road, casting her questioning looks. She knew what they were thinking. She wouldn't last, but she didn't care. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to save her uncle's livelihood. Murphy tossed her a set of keys to a battered yellow cab with peeling paint and a cracked dashboard. "Don't wreck it," he muttered, "and don't expect any favors." Emma climbed in, adjusting the stiff seat and gripping the wheel. The interior smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, and the radio crackled with static as she tested the buttons. She glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing her own reflection, nervous but determined. "This is temporary," she whispered to herself. "Just until Uncle George is back on his feet." Her first few hours were a trial by fire. Navigating the city's dense traffic was one thing, but dealing with impatient customers was another. Some barely acknowledged her, tossing crumpled bills her way before rushing off. Others scoffed at the sight of a female driver, muttering under their breath about how the industry's changed. By the time the afternoon rush hit, her nerves were fried. Then came the call. Car 22, priority pickup at Westbridge Private Airport. Her dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Emma hesitated. Private airport pickups meant wealthy clientele, high expectations, and big tips. But they also meant no room for mistakes. "I'll take it," she said, gripping the wheel tighter. As she pulled up outside the sleek, glass-fronted terminal, her taxi looked embarrassingly out of place among the luxury black sedans and private chauffeurs. She tried to smooth down her ponytail, reminding herself that professionalism was about confidence, not appearances. The automatic doors slid open, and he stepped out. A tall man in a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and polished leather shoes. He moved with a kind of effortless authority. The kind of presence that turned heads without trying. His dark hair was neatly styled, his sharp cheekbones accentuated by the cool morning light. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, while the other tapped rapidly against his phone screen. He stopped in front of her window, his piercing gaze assessing her. She blinked, startled that he knew her name. Yeah, that's me. I'm Lucas Bennett, he said smoothly. My assistant booked this ride. I need to get downtown. Multiple meetings. Tight schedule. Emma nodded, understood. As Lucas settled into the back seat, she pulled away from the curb, merging onto the highway. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of his phone keyboard as he fired off emails. His deep voice occasionally broke the silence, speaking in measured tones about mergers, investments, and corporate strategies. Emma had no idea who he was, but it was clear he wasn't just some executive. He was the executive. Traffic thickened as they neared the city center. Emma adjusted her grip on the wheel, weaving between lanes with a calculated ease she hadn't realized she possessed. She could feel Lucas watching her through the rearview mirror, his gaze sharp yet unreadable. "How long have you been driving?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Emma hesitated. A little while. He arched an eyebrow. "You're surprisingly composed for a newbie." She almost laughed at the irony. Composed. She was a mess beneath the surface. Exhausted, anxious, barely holding it together. "I guess I have a lot riding on this," she admitted. Lucas didn't pry, but something in his expression shifted, as if he had just filed away that piece of information for later. By the time they reached his destination, a gleaming skyscraper with tinted windows reflecting the city skyline, Emma was already bracing for the standard end. A ride exchange, a quick thanks, and a tip. Instead, Lucas handed her several crisp bills, far more than what the meter read. Her eyes widened. "This is too much." "Keep it," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Consider it an investment." Emma frowned, unsure what he meant. Then, just as she thought he was about to walk away, he turned back. "Can you wait here? I have another meeting in an hour. I'd prefer to use the same driver." She blinked. "You want me to stay?" "Yes," Lucas said simply. "If you're free." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." And just like that, her day took an unexpected turn. For the next few hours, she became Lucas Bennett's personal driver, shuttling him between meetings, corporate offices, and one impossibly high-end restaurant. He was constantly on the phone, his voice calm and commanding as he discussed contracts and negotiations that sounded worth millions. She stole glances at him in the mirror. He was a mystery, a man who seemed untouchable, yet oddly observant. Finally, their last stop was an upscale boutique hotel in the city's financial district. As Lucas gathered his things, he lingered for a moment. "Thank you, Emma. You're resourceful and punctual. I appreciate that." Before she could respond, he slid a business card onto the front seat. "In case you ever decide taxi driving isn't enough." She stared at it as he disappeared into the hotel lobby. The name on the card made her breath catch. Lucas Bennett, CO, Bennett Enterprises. Emma sat there, gripping the wheel, stunned. A CEO had just handed her his card, and she had no idea what it meant, or why she felt like, somehow, she'd just been offered a glimpse into a world she never imagined entering. Emma had barely processed the weight of the business card sitting on her dashboard when her radio crackled again. Another pickup request. Another night of endless driving. She shoved the card into the glove compartment, shaking off the surreal encounter. Lucas Bennett was just another passenger. A ridiculously wealthy, strangely perceptive passenger. Nothing more. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and determination. She worked every shift she could, running on cheap coffee and adrenaline, knowing that every dollar mattered. Uncle George's condition had worsened. His doctor had officially recommended spinal surgery, and while insurance would cover part of it, the remaining costs were devastating. Emma didn't have time to dwell on distractions. Not on her fatigue, not on Lucas Bennett. And yet, fate had other plans. It was a week after their first meeting when Emma's radio buzzed with an unusual request. Car 22, we have a specific pickup. Passenger is requesting Emma Sullivan by name. Her grip on the wheel tightened. No way. Repeat that, dispatch, she said, her voice hesitant. The reply was immediate. Emma, it's for you. Pick up at Hamilton Towers. A Mr. Bennett. Her stomach flipped. He requested me. Emma debated ignoring it. She didn't like feeling like some charity case. But a priority passenger meant priority pay. And right now, she needed every dollar she could get. Gritting her teeth, she accepted the call and drove toward the towering glass structure of Hamilton Towers, one of the most expensive office buildings in the city. Lucas was already waiting outside, his phone in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his tailored coat. He looked different today. A little less composed, a little more rushed. His usual sharp expression softened slightly when he spotted her pulling up. He slid into the back seat, discarding his suit jacket beside him. Thanks for coming on short notice. Emma forced a polite smile. Happy to help. I have a packed schedule. 3 meetings scattered across the city. Think you can handle it? She glanced at him in the rearview mirror, raising an eyebrow. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair point. They weaved through traffic, and Lucas did what he always did, dived into work, orchestrating million-dollar deals like it was second nature. Emma, meanwhile, focused on the road, though she couldn't ignore the occasional glances he cast her way. Halfway through their second stop, he finally broke the silence. You don't look well, he observed. Everything okay? Emma hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter. She hated when people pried, especially when she was barely keeping it together. But for some reason, lying to Lucas felt pointless. I'm just dealing with some family stuff, she admitted, keeping her eyes on the road, and money problems. Lucas studied her carefully. Is there anything I can do? Emma let out a dry laugh. Not unless you can magically cover my uncle's surgery and pay off my back rent. A silence stretched between them, heavier than she expected. When she dared to glance in the mirror, she found Lucas watching her with an unreadable expression. Let me know if you change your mind, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Emma swallowed, not sure what to make of that. The rest of the ride was filled with an odd, tense silence. Lucas went back to his emails, and Emma tried to pretend like she hadn't just casually confessed that her life was falling apart to a billionaire. When they reached his final stop, a sleek, modern restaurant in the heart of downtown, Lucas gathered his things and paused before stepping out. Have lunch with me, he said suddenly. Emma blinked. What? You've been running on fumes. Take a break. Eat something. On me. She opened her mouth to decline, but at that moment her stomach betrayed her, letting out a loud, humiliating growl. Lucas raised an eyebrow, amused. Emma groaned. Fine, but only because I don't turn down free food. Inside, the restaurant was nothing like the dingy diners she was used to. White tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, waiters in pristine uniforms. Emma felt wildly out of place. Lucas, however, seemed perfectly at ease. Relax, he said, noticing her stiff posture. It's just food. Food that probably costs more than my electric bill, she muttered under her breath. His lips twitched. Depends on what you order. As they ate, conversation drifted to more personal topics. Lucas asked about her childhood, her ambitions, things she hadn't thought about in a long time. And in return, he shared parts of himself. "I wasn't always Lucas Bennett, CEO of Bennett Enterprises," he admitted. "I grew up barely scraping by. I started my first company out of desperation. If someone hadn't taken a chance on me, I'd probably still be stuck in some dead-end job." Emma looked at him differently then. Not just as a rich businessman, but as someone who understood struggle. By the time lunch ended, something had shifted. As they walked back to her cab, Lucas handed her a folder. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open. "An offer," he said. "A paid internship in my logistics department. Part-time, flexible hours. It's yours if you want it." Emma's breath caught. She stared at the paperwork, then back at him. "Why?" Lucas's expression was calm, but his eyes were serious. "Because I see potential. And because I know what it's like to need a lifeline." Emma's heart pounded. She had spent so long fighting to stay afloat, convinced no one would ever offer her a hand. And now, here it was. But was this really an opportunity, or just pity? She wasn't sure. But as she watched Lucas walk away, one thought burned in her mind. If I say yes, everything changes. Emma sat in her cab long after Lucas had disappeared into the restaurant, the folder still clutched in her hand. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, like she was holding something dangerous. A lifeline. A way out. She should have been elated. It was a stable job, something that didn't involve dodging drunks in the backseat of a rundown taxi at 2 a.m. It was more money, more security, more of everything she never thought she'd have. So why did it feel like a betrayal? She thought of Uncle George, of the years he had spent working himself into the ground just to keep food on the table for her. She thought of how hard he had fought to keep that medallion, the only thing standing between them and complete ruin. If she walked away from the taxi now, wasn't she just proving Murphy and all the other drivers right? That she was too soft, too weak, too inexperienced to last in this business. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. "Uncle George, doctor says surgery is mandatory. No driving for months. I'm so sorry, kiddo." Emma's stomach dropped. Months? She slumped back in her seat, staring at the screen. There was no way she could keep this up alone. She had been barely scraping by with both of them relying on the taxi's income. If George couldn't work for months, how would they survive? The numbers in her bank account were bleak. The bills on her counter weren't going anywhere. And the folder in her lap, the opportunity she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. The opportunity she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. There was no choice, not really. The next morning, she dressed in the cleanest professional-looking outfit she could throw together. A thrifted button-up shirt and a pair of black slacks that were slightly too big, and walked through the glass doors of Bennett Enterprises. The lobby alone felt like another universe. Sleek, polished floors reflected the sunlight streaming through the towering windows. A receptionist in a sharp gray blazer greeted her with a polite but questioning glance. "Emma Sullivan," she said, forcing herself to stand taller. "I have a meeting with Mr. Bennett." The woman nodded, clicking through her computer before directing her to the 20th floor. As the elevator ascended, Emma exhaled slowly, forcing her nerves into submission. She wasn't going to beg. If Lucas thought she was some kind of charity case, she'd walk right back out that door. When the elevator door slid open, Lucas was already waiting in the hallway, hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. A quiet, knowing look, like he already knew she would come. "Follow me," he said simply. She did, walking past rows of cubicles, large conference rooms, and glass-walled offices where executives in crisp suits debated over million-dollar deals. Lucas led her into a spacious office with a panoramic view of the city. He motioned toward a chair across from his desk. "Sit." Emma hesitated for only a second before lowering herself into the seat, placing the folder on the desk between them. "I'm not here because I want a handout," she said before he could speak. "If I do this, it's because I'm earning it. Not because you feel sorry for me." Lucas leaned back in his chair, watching her with quiet amusement. "Noted." Emma exhaled, her pulse still hammering in her ears. "And I need to know something. If I take this job, what happens to my uncle's medallion? If I stop driving, they'll revoke it." Lucas studied her for a moment, then reached into his desk and pulled out a different folder. She frowned. "What's that?" "Research," he said. "There's a clause in the city's medallion policy, one that allows a driver to keep their medallion under extended medical leave if they apply before their provisional period expires." Emma's heart stuttered. "So, we can keep it if we move fast, yes." Lucas met her gaze, his voice steady. "I can push it through. Make a few calls. But the decision to take this job, that's yours." She stared at him, trying to find the catch. "You really went and researched all this?" she asked, skeptical. He shrugged. "I don't offer opportunities unless I'm sure they'll work." Emma swallowed, something tight and unfamiliar forming in her chest. Relief. The offer had felt too good to be true, but Lucas wasn't just throwing her a lifeline. He was making sure she wouldn't have to sacrifice everything else to take it. She hesitated only a second longer before reaching for the pen. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Lucas's lips curved slightly. "Good." And just like that, everything changed. By the next day, the paperwork had been filed. The taxi depot had been notified. Uncle George's medallion was safe. Emma turned in her cab keys, exchanging the smell of cigarette smoke and worn leather for the unfamiliar scent of fresh ink and polished desks. She walked into Bennett Enterprises on her first official day with her head held high, trying not to let the stares of other employees unnerve her. Some of them were curious. Others were skeptical. She didn't blame them. She wasn't exactly corporate material. But she was here. And if she had learned anything from driving the streets of Westbridge, it was this. Survival wasn't about where you came from. It was about what you did next. Emma adjusted her blouse for the 100th time as she walked into Bennett Enterprises for her first full day. The office air smelled like fresh ink, expensive cologne, and polished ambition, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes, and stale confit she had been breathing in for weeks inside her taxi. She kept her head high, ignoring the curious glances from employees who clearly weren't used to seeing someone like her here. She didn't belong. Not yet. But she would. Lucas had placed her in the logistics department, a fast-paced, high-pressure environment that managed everything from supply chain coordination to high-level corporate partnerships. He hadn't given her a make-work job or a cushy assistant position. He had thrown her straight into the fire. Her first meeting was a disaster. She sat at the long conference table, surrounded by seasoned professionals, rattling off jargon that may as well have been a foreign language. They barely glanced at her. The new girl, the charity case. She gritted her teeth and took notes. If they thought she wouldn't keep up, they were wrong. After hours of studying spreadsheets, reading industry reports, and watching how people moved through the office, Emma started to see the patterns. Logistics wasn't all that different from navigating a city in a taxi. It was about timing, efficiency, and anticipating problems before they happened. Still, she had barely begun proving herself when the first sign of trouble appeared. That evening, she was sorting through documents in the break room when she overheard two employees whispering. "You heard about the Sullivan girl? Keogh's little pet project?" Emma froze, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup in her hands. "He plucks her from a taxi. gives her a job with zero experience. It's obvious why. Think they're sleeping together? A sharp laugh. Please. More like she's his charity case. He'll get bored soon enough. Emma clenched her jaw and forced herself to breathe. She had expected this. She had known walking into this world would come with assumptions, but hearing it aloud still stung. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to storm out. She was going to prove them wrong. The next day, Emma doubled down. She arrived before anyone else, stayed later than everyone. She tackled small projects no one else wanted, volunteered for extra work, and refused to let herself be overlooked. Lucas noticed. "Your department head says you've been taking on extra responsibilities," he remarked one afternoon, stopping by her desk. "Are you sure you're not overextending yourself?" Emma forced a casual shrug. "I have a lot to learn." Lucas studied her, his sharp gaze seeing too much. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Emma." But she did. And she would. It wasn't long before she began seeing the cracks in the company's logistics system. Missed deliveries, inefficient routing. Things she never would have noticed before, but now stood out like bad turns on a congested highway. One night, she stayed late analyzing reports, her desk illuminated only by the soft glow of her computer screen. What she found made her blood run cold. There were irregularities in the supply chain invoices. Routes that made no sense, payments that didn't add up. Someone in the department was skimming money from the company, and it wasn't a small sum. Emma's heart pounded. This wasn't just a mistake. This was fraud. She gathered everything, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the undeniable evidence on her screen. She had two choices: report it and risk exposing herself to retaliation. Ignore it and pretend she never saw anything. She already knew what Uncle George would say. "Do what's right, kiddo, even when it's hard." Emma swallowed her fear and knocked on Lucas's office door. He was still there, his suit jacket discarded over the back of his chair, the city skyline glowing behind him. He glanced up, surprised. "Emma?" She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. "I found something, and I think it's bad." Lucas's expression sharpened instantly, all traces of casual conversation gone. "Show me." She walked to his desk and laid out the evidence, her pulse hammering. Lucas scanned the documents, his face unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was cold, dangerous. "Who else knows about this?" "No one," she said quietly. "Good," he muttered, "because if you're right, this isn't just an accounting error. This is theft." A chill ran down Emma's spine. She had wanted to prove herself. She hadn't expected to uncover a scandal. Emma sat stiffly across from Lucas, watching as his sharp eyes skimmed the reports she had laid before him. The silence in the office was thick, charged, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside the window. Finally, he exhaled and set the papers down, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This is bad." Emma swallowed. "I know." "You're sure no one else has seen this?" She nodded. "I came straight to you." Lucas leaned back, his expression unreadable. Whoever is behind this isn't just skimming a little cash. These numbers suggest a long-term, coordinated operation. If they realize someone's onto them, they'll cover their tracks, she finished. Lucas's lips pressed into a thin line. Or worse. A chill crept up Emma's spine. She had wanted to prove herself, but she hadn't expected to land in the middle of something that felt dangerously close to corporate warfare. "What do we do?" she asked. Lucas studied her for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "First, we don't panic." Emma listened as he made a few cryptic calls, his voice smooth but commanding, setting up discreet meetings and requesting deeper financial audits. When he finally hung up, he turned to her. "I need you to keep your head down for the next few days," he said. "Act like nothing's wrong." Emma frowned.
That's not exactly my strong suit.
A small smirk ghosted across his lips. "I've noticed." Then his expression turned serious again. "But I mean it, Emma. This isn't just office gossip or company politics. Whoever is doing this has been getting away with it for a while. They won't want to be exposed." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders, but she nodded. "Okay." She left his office with her mind spinning. Emma had been so focused on proving herself that she hadn't stopped to consider what that might cost her. And now she wasn't just navigating a new job. She was walking a tightrope over something dangerous. For the next few days, she followed Lucas's instructions. She watched. She waited. And she noticed things she hadn't before. The way certain employees guarded their files too closely. The way one executive in logistics, Patrick Langley, flinched every time financial reports were mentioned. The way conversations hushed whenever Lucas walked by. She might have still been a newcomer, but she wasn't blind. Then, late one evening, as she was leaving the office, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust." Emma's heart stopped. Her fingers trembled as she typed back. "Who is this?" No response. She turned in a slow circle, suddenly hyper, aware of how empty the office floor was. The hair on the back of her neck prickled. Someone knew she was looking. That night, she barely slept. By the time she arrived at the office the next morning, the exhaustion was weighing her down, but she pushed through, determined not to let her fears show. Lucas, however, noticed immediately. "You look terrible," he remarked, handing her a coffee without being asked. Emma accepted it, sighing. "Gee, thanks." His gaze sharpened. Something happened. She hesitated. Telling him meant bringing him into this mess even deeper. Not telling him meant facing it alone. She sighed. "I got a text last night. An anonymous warning." Lucas's expression darkened. "Let me see it." She handed him her phone, and as he read the message, his jaw tightened. "This changes things," he muttered. Emma scoffed. "No kidding." Lucas set the phone down. "You need to be careful, Emma. You're a liability to them now. If they think you'll talk—" "I'm not backing down," she interrupted, fire flashing in her eyes. A muscle in Lucas's jaw twitched. Then, to her surprise, a flicker of admiration crossed his face. "Of course you're not," he said, almost to himself. The air between them shifted, charged, unspoken. Then Lucas cleared his throat. "All right. We do this the smart way, quietly." Emma folded her arms. "And if things get loud?" A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at his lips. "Then we make sure we win." Later that evening, as Emma was about to leave, Lucas stopped her at the door. "Change of plans," he said. "Come with me." Emma frowned. "Where?" He grabbed his coat to find out exactly how deep this goes. Emma's stomach flipped. She wasn't sure what was more unnerving. The situation she had gotten herself into, or the fact that she trusted Lucas Bennett completely. And that might be the most dangerous thing of all. Emma's heart raced as she followed Lucas through the winding corridors of Bennett Enterprises, the cool light from the glass walls casting long shadows in their wake. The hum of the office had quieted down for the night, but there was something about the stillness that made everything feel more dangerous. Her instincts were on high alert. Everything in her told her this night wasn't going to end quietly. They had spent the past few days gathering intel, cautiously tracking down the source of the fraudulent activities, trying to piece together the puzzle without letting anyone catch wind of what they were doing. But now, with the anonymous warning hanging over her head and the pressure mounting from all sides, Emma had no choice but to follow Lucas into the dark heart of the problem. At first, "This isn't just about money anymore, is it?" Emma asked quietly as they reached the stairwell, the weight of their investigation pressing down on her chest. "There's something more to this." Lucas didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened as they descended the steps. His usual calm demeanor was slipping, and for the first time since Emma had met him, she saw the hint of something darker behind his eyes. "No," he said finally. "This is much bigger than we thought." Emma's stomach twisted. She wanted to press him for more answers, but she knew better than to pry further when he was in this kind of mood. Lucas was calculating, always 5 steps ahead, and she was just starting to see how much he had been holding back. They reached the lower level of the building where the confidential files were stored. It was a restricted area. No one was supposed to be down here without special clearance. But Lucas moved with an air of authority, effortlessly bypassing the security system as if it were child's play. Emma's respect for him deepened, though the weight of the situation only grew heavier. He motioned to the vault-like doors at the far end of the room. "We need to get in there. That's where the real evidence is." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What's in there?" Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he took out a set of keys and swiped a card across the door's scanner. The lock clicked open, and Emma followed him into the darkened room, her heart pounding. The room was filled with rows of metal cabinets, each one labeled with a series of confidential documents. But it wasn't the files that caught Emma's attention. It was a large safe sitting against the far wall, its sleek design almost out of place in this dim, utilitarian space. "That's where the real secrets are," Lucas said, his voice low. "The stuff we couldn't trace through the digital files." Emma's mind raced. She had a sinking feeling she knew where this was going. "What are you talking about, Lucas?" "What's in that safe?" Without answering, Lucas moved toward it, entering a passcode that Emma didn't have a chance to catch. The heavy door of the safe clicked open, and what lay inside took her breath away. Stacks of cash, large amounts neatly organized. Along with the money were dozens of documents, each stamped with confidential in bold red letters. But the most shocking part, one document that stood out from the rest, a contract with Ethan Caldwell's signature at the bottom. Emma's blood ran cold. "You were right," she whispered. "This goes all the way to the top." Lucas nodded grimly. "Ethan's been using the company as a front. He's been skimming funds, running illegal operations, and using the taxi medallions to launder money. All of it's tied back to his dealings with corrupt officials." Emma's mind spun. This was no longer just about her uncle's medallion. This was about corporate corruption, money laundering, and a web of deceit that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined. She had stepped into something far bigger than she ever intended. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to her, his eyes dark with determination. "We expose him, but we have to be careful. Ethan has too much power, and we can't risk anyone getting hurt." Emma's stomach twisted again, but there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about saving her uncle's livelihood anymore. This was about taking down a corrupt system. She glanced at the safe, at the damning evidence Lucas had uncovered. It was enough to bring down the entire operation. But they couldn't just walk away with it. They had to play their cards carefully. The stakes had never been higher, and Emma was ready to fight for everything that mattered. For her uncle, for the truth, and for the life she had started to build, even if it meant facing down one of the most dangerous men in the city. Emma's hands trembled as she walked out of the elevator, the weight of the file tucked under her arm pressing down on her like a stone. The air in Bennett Enterprises felt thick with tension, the usual hum of productivity replaced by an undercurrent of urgency that she couldn't shake. She had done everything right, gathering evidence, tracking every lead, staying under the radar. But now that the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, there was no turning back. The documents she was carrying were explosive. They detailed not only Ethan Caldwell's illegal dealings, but also his manipulation of the city's medallion system, the very thing that had put her uncle's livelihood at risk. Ethan had been using his influence to orchestrate deals with corrupt officials, skimming funds and funneling money through legitimate businesses to cover his tracks. The more Emma dug, the more disgusted she became by how deeply his hands were buried in the city's infrastructure. Everything okay? Emma looked up to find Lucas standing in front of her office door, his gaze sharp and knowing. He'd been watching her closely since their late-night investigation. Ever since she'd found the safe, she knew she could no longer rely on her own judgment. She needed Lucas's guidance. He had the experience, the connections, and the knowledge of how to handle a situation like this. But even more than that, she had begun to trust him completely. In a world full of deceit, he was one of the few constants she could count on. "I think we have everything we need," Emma replied, her voice steady. But inside, she was on edge. "The evidence is clear, but we're going to need to be careful." Lucas studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he stepped closer. "I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about how we're going to play this." Emma nodded, her stomach twisting. "We can't just take this to the authorities yet. Ethan has too many connections. If we move too fast, he'll cover his tracks before we have a chance to prove anything." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed.
So what's the plan?
Emma hesitated. The risk of confronting Ethan head-on was enormous. There was a fine line between exposing the truth and setting off a chain of events that could ruin their lives. But she wasn't about to let him get away with it, not after everything her uncle had been through, not after all the sacrifices she had made. "We need to get the right people involved," Emma said. "We take this to someone who has the authority to take Ethan down. But we can't risk tipping him off." Lucas's eyes gleamed with something close to admiration. "Smart. We have one shot at this," Emma said, her voice low. "I'll send a copy of these documents to a journalist I trust. Someone who isn't afraid to dig into this. Someone who won't be intimidated by Caldwell's connections." Lucas nodded slowly, clearly impressed by her calm in the face of such uncertainty. "All right, and once it's out there..." Emma took a deep breath, knowing what they were about to do would change everything. "Once it's out there, we go public. We make sure the whole city knows exactly who Ethan Caldwell is." Lucas's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, the weight of their shared burden seemed to lift. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" Emma smiled wryly. "I don't have a choice anymore." Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "I've already started compiling the data. If you're ready to make a move, I'm with you." She stared at him for a moment, the weight of his offer settling over her. She had gone from a girl driving a taxi for survival to someone who was about to take down one of the most powerful men in the city. "I'm ready," Emma said finally, her voice steady, resolute. Together, they walked into the conference room, the file in her hands feeling like a lifeline and a weapon all at once. As Lucas started to plug in the drive, Emma took a deep breath and prepared for the battle ahead, not just for her uncle's medallion, but for the truth that would bring Ethan Caldwell to his knees. She wasn't just fighting for her family anymore. She was fighting for the chance to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the seconds stretched like hours. She had just sent the anonymous journalist all the files, the evidence they had painstakingly gathered over the last few weeks. The truth was out there now, waiting to be exposed. But as much as she tried to prepare herself, the fear that gripped her was undeniable. What would Ethan do when he found out? How far would he go to protect himself, especially now that she was part of the equation? Lucas's steady presence beside her in the small, dimly lit conference room was the only thing keeping her grounded. He didn't say much, but she could feel the quiet understanding between them. They were in this together now, and no matter what happened, they had crossed a point of no return. The phone call she had been waiting for came at precisely 10:47 p.m. The display on her screen lit up the name of the investigative journalist she had reached out to, flashing in bold letters. With a deep breath, she answered, "Emma, it's done." Her stomach dropped. "It's out there." "It's out there. The story's live. I've already sent it to the major outlets, news, blogs, social media. Ethan's going to be on the defensive within hours." The relief she felt was immediate, but it was quickly overshadowed by the gnawing realization that the hardest part was still ahead. They had no idea how Ethan would react. The man had connections everywhere. His influence reached deep into the city's core, and the more she learned about him, the more she understood how ruthless he could be. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." "I know exactly what it means," the journalist replied. "And I won't let Ethan get away with this. Stay safe, Emma." The line went dead. Emma stared at the phone in her hand for a moment before setting it down. The weight of what they had just done pressed on her chest again. But there was no turning back now. She had gone from being a nervous, inexperienced driver to someone on the cusp of changing her life, and the lives of many others. "You okay?" Lucas asked, his voice breaking through the silence. Emma nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "It's just..." Lucas watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he stood up, moving toward the door. "It's done. We've done our part. Now we wait." She followed him, the exhaustion from the past few weeks settling heavily in her bones. She had barely slept, constantly on edge as they worked in the shadows, trying to stay one step ahead of Ethan. But now that the truth was out there, Emma knew that the real battle was just beginning. They had just made a powerful enemy, and Emma wasn't naive enough to believe that Ethan would simply roll over. He would retaliate. And when he did, Emma had to be ready. The next few days were a blur. News outlets picked up the story quickly, and the city was buzzing with whispers of Ethan Caldwell's corruption. People who had been too afraid to speak up before now had a voice. Emma's phone rang constantly, journalists asking for statements, police investigators wanting more information. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, it was empowering. The scales were tipping. Still, there was a constant sense of unease gnawing at her. Ethan hadn't made his move yet, but she knew it was coming. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then it happened. The first piece of retaliation came in the form of a text message. "You've made a mistake, Emma. This isn't over. You're going to regret this." Her stomach twisted, but Emma refused to flinch. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to back down now. She knew what Ethan was capable of, but she also knew what she had to do to protect herself. And her family. "You're not getting away with this, Caldwell," she muttered to herself, her resolve hardening. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern. He had seen the text, too. But instead of panic, he looked calm, like this was just another obstacle to overcome. "Let's move forward," he said quietly, his voice filled with purpose. "We have the evidence, And now we make sure everyone knows the truth. This doesn't stop here. Emma nodded, her mind clear. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She had come this far, and now she was going to finish it. Together, they would take Ethan down. And there was no turn back. Emma stood at the edge of the city's skyline, the lights twinkling below like a sea of stars. She leaned against the cold glass, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph settle in her chest. The past few weeks had been a blur of tension, betrayal, and risk. But it had led her here, to this moment of quiet reflection. They had won. They had exposed the corruption that had rotted the city from the inside, and Ethan Caldwell, the man who had nearly destroyed her family, was now facing the consequences of his actions. And yet, even with the victory still so fresh, Emma couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. She had torn down one world only to build a new one, and while the new one was still taking shape, she felt the delicate balance of it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew it would be different. Emma. Emma. Lucas's voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing behind her, his expression soft, his gaze full of quiet admiration. "I thought you might be out here," he said, stepping closer. "You okay?" She met his eyes and gave a small nod. "Yeah, just trying to let it all sink in." He smiled, but there was an edge to his smile, something more than just relief. He had been with her every step of the way, through the sleepless nights, the tension, filled meetings, and the moments of doubt. He had been the one to keep her grounded when she thought she might break. "You've done more than just expose a criminal, Emma," Lucas said, his voice low, almost reverent. "You've changed everything." She shrugged, but the words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always thought of herself as just a driver, just someone trying to make it day by day. But in this moment, she realized that she was more than just a survivor. More than just a survivor, more than just someone holding on to what she had. She'd become someone who fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly, taking a step closer to him. Lucas's gaze softened, his hand brushing against hers. "You would have done it on your own. You know, I just helped you see what you were already capable of." She smiled at that, though it was bittersweet. There was so much more she needed to say, but she couldn't find the words. Her life had been one long road of struggle, a constant effort to stay afloat. But with Lucas by her side, that road was starting to feel less like a battle, and more like an adventure. "What now?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas paused, considering the question. "Now we keep moving forward. You've earned your place here, Emma. Don't forget that. And if you ever feel like you're not enough, just remember you're more than what you were yesterday." Emma looked out over the city again, taking in the view. For the first time in a long while, she felt like the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on her. She wasn't just a girl trying to survive. She was someone with a future, someone with choices. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start living again. She turned back to Lucas, the flickering light from the city reflecting in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. They had come so far together, and now it was time to move forward. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because in the end, they had built something that neither of them had ever expected. A future that was no longer defined by the past. And that was more than enough. The days after the expose were a whirlwind of media attention, legal battles, and constant tension. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had slept more than a few hours, but the adrenaline that had carried her through the darkest days now seemed to have a life of its own, propelling her forward despite the exhaustion, that tugged at her every step. The city had been shaken to its core by the truth about Ethan Caldwell and his empire of deceit, and people were finally talking. The press had a field day, and Emma had become the unexpected hero in a story she never imagined being part of. But as the dust began to settle, she realized that while exposing Caldwell's corruption was a huge victory, the aftermath wasn't going to be easy. Ethan was already working behind the scenes, using his vast network to try and discredit the investigation. His reach had extended to law enforcement, to city officials, and even to influential figures who had been part of his scheme. The fight was far from over. One night, as Emma sat alone in her apartment, a message popped up on her phone. It was from an anonymous number. "It's not over." The words sent a chill through her. Despite all the legal pressure on Ethan, despite his empire crumbling, it felt like the battle was just beginning. He wasn't the type of man to go down quietly. Emma's pulse quickened, but she refused to let fear take root. She had fought too hard to let him intimidate her now. The next day, she met with Lucas at a small private cafe away from the eyes of the press. "You've seen the message," he said without greeting, his face tight with concern. Emma nodded. "He's not finished. He's going to keep coming for me, for both of us." Lucas's eyes darkened. "We've already exposed everything. He doesn't have the power to hurt you unless we let him." Emma leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping nervously against her coffee cup. She'd learned quickly that the world they were dealing with wasn't one that would let them simply walk away from the fallout. Ethan had powerful friends, and those friends weren't about to let their schemes unravel without a fight. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "I didn't come this far just to give up now." Lucas studied her for a long moment, then reached across the table to place his hand over hers. "I know, but we need a plan. This won't be over until Ethan's completely gone from the picture, and that means making sure he's not a threat anymore." The realization hit Emma like a freight train. They had only exposed the tip of the iceberg. There was still so much left to dismantle. So many people who were complicit in Caldwell's criminal activities. The political machine that had kept him in power was as corrupt as he was, and if they were going to end this, they would need to strike a decisive blow. "I have an idea," Emma said, her voice hardening with resolve. "But we'll need to be smart. We can't make any more mistakes." Lucas's brows furrowed, but he nodded. "I trust you." Emma leaned in, lowering her voice. "We go after his connections, the ones who are still standing by him, who have the most to lose if this all comes crashing down. I'll leverage what we've already exposed, and we'll make sure they know we're not going to back off." Lucas's eyes sparkled with approval. "You're thinking ahead. I like it." They spent the next few hours hashing out the details, carefully crafting a strategy to take down the last remnants of Caldwell's operation. It wasn't going to be easy, and it would mean facing more danger than Emma was used to. But she was done being a passive player in this game. She had already lost too much to stop now. The first step was clear. They needed to turn Caldwell's own people against him. Use the truth they had gathered to force his allies to make a choice. Stand with him and go down with the ship, or betray him and save themselves. Emma wasn't sure who would crack first, but she was willing to bet that greed and self-preservation would win out. As the plan took shape, Emma couldn't help but feel a surge of empowerment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone Caldwell had hurt, everyone he had deceived. This was her chance to finish what she had started, to make sure no one else ever had to suffer like she had. The fight was far from over, but Emma was ready. This time, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for justice. And with Lucas at her side, there was no way she was going to lose. A year had passed since that pivotal night when Emma had sent the final report to the press, exposing Ethan Caldwell's empire of lies and corruption. The city had never been the same, and neither had Emma. She wasn't the same girl who had started out driving a taxi, barely keeping her head above water. She'd gone from being a victim of circumstance to becoming a catalyst for change, a symbol of resilience and defiance, a symbol of resilience and defiance. And in all of that, one thing had become clear. She had found something she never thought she would: peace. Today, Emma stood in the small apartment she now shared with Uncle George. The walls, once bare and filled with the harsh reminders of their struggle, were now decorated with personal touches. Family photos, artwork from local markets, a new couch that felt, for the first time in a long while, like home. Uncle George was doing well. His recovery from surgery had been slow, but he had his independence back. And with the extended medical hold on his taxi medallion, he was now back on the road. Not as the overworked driver he had once been, but at a pace that suited him, allowing him to take better care of himself. Emma's mind often wandered to that moment in the hospital, the night she'd told him about the job offer from Lucas. She had been hesitant then, unsure of the future and what it would mean to walk away from a life she knew. But today she could look back and see the path that had led her here, not just in terms of her career, but her growth, her transformation. The phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She checked it, a smile forming when she saw the message. "Lucas, dinner tonight. I've got something I want to talk to you about." She couldn't help but laugh softly. It had been a few months since they had officially become a couple, though the bond had long been there. Their partnership had started as a business alliance, a shared goal of bringing down a corrupt empire. But over time, it had become something far deeper. They had learned to rely on each other, not just in the boardroom or in moments of crisis, but in the quiet moments too. The way Lucas cared for her, the way he encouraged her to pursue her dreams, had changed the way Emma saw herself. She wasn't just someone who fought for justice anymore. She was someone who had earned love, trust, and the future she was now building. She texted back quickly, a simple response that felt like a promise for the future. "Emma, I'll be there. Can't wait to see you." As the day turned into evening, Emma got ready for dinner, still marveling at the life she had created. She had taken that first step into the unknown a year ago, unsure of what was ahead but trusting in her instincts. That leap of faith had carried her through every challenge, every setback, and now it was leading her toward something she could barely have imagined. At the restaurant, Lucas was already seated, his usual calm demeanor settling over him as he looked up when she approached. There was something different about him tonight, something more vulnerable, as though there was something he wanted to say, but hadn't yet found the words. "Hey," she greeted him softly, sitting down beside him. "Hey," he replied, his voice warm. "I've been thinking." He paused, eyes searching hers, the weight of what he was about to say clearly on his mind. "I know we've been through a lot this year, together, separately. But I want to know if you're ready for the next step. If you're ready to—" Before he could finish, Emma reached across the table, resting her hand gently on his. "Lucas, I'm already where I need to be." He stared at her for a long moment, then smiled, the tension melting from his shoulders. "Good," he said quietly, "because I don't want to imagine a future without you in it." The words hung in the air between them, the sincerity in his voice echoing in Emma's chest. She knew that they had both fought their own battles, faced their own fears, and come out stronger. But they were no longer just surviving. They were living. As the evening stretched on, they talked about everything and nothing. The future, the past, the plans they had, and the adventures that awaited them. And through it all, Emma realized that this was the life she had built, a life filled with purpose, love, and possibility. And as they left the restaurant, hand in hand, Emma couldn't help but think back to the night she first climbed into that beat-up yellow taxi, uncertain and scared. She had no idea how much it would change her life, But now, with Lucas by her side and a world of opportunities ahead, she could finally breathe. She had found her place in the world. Emma's journey is a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and the unwavering belief that we are capable of more than we often realize. What started as a desperate fight to save her uncle's livelihood turned into a battle for justice that exposed the darkest corners of the city's most powerful players. But perhaps the most valuable lesson Emma learned was that the hardest challenges often lead to the most meaningful growth. Throughout her story, she faced constant obstacles: fear, doubt, betrayal. But what truly made her stand out was her ability to rise, to keep pushing forward, even when the world seemed stacked against her. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something greater, for truth, for family, and for herself. And in doing so, she discovered that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what we're given, but in what we choose to do with what we have. Emma also learned the importance of trusting others and leaning on the people who genuinely care about you. Lucas, her partner, not only supported her during the toughest moments, but also believed in her potential when she couldn't see it herself. Their journey together highlighted the importance of having someone to stand by you, but also the courage to step forward on your own when it matters most. So what can we learn from Emma's story? Never give up, trust your instincts, and never underestimate your own strength. Life will always throw challenges our way, but how we choose to face them defines our future. If you were inspired by Emma's journey and want to hear more stories of hope, courage, and transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.